All right. Well, hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Greg Keston. I teach in the physics department and I serve as Associate Director of Science Education. And on behalf of Harvard's Division of Science, the Harvard Bookstore, and Harvard Library, I'm very excited to welcome you to this Harvard Science Book Talk event with Professor Robert Sapolsky, who will be discussing his book, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will with Professor Joshua Green. But before we get into that, um, I want to tell you a little bit about other events that we have coming up in this series. So if you want to find the other events, our website, you can if you just Google Harvard Science Book Talks, you should be able to find our website with those events, or on YouTube, you can search the same thing and find previous events. A couple of our upcoming talks, we have Sean Carroll on May 13th, talking about quanta and fields, the biggest ideas in the universe. And then on May 8th, we have Venki Ramakrishnan, who's talking about why we die. But tonight, very excited to have Professor Robert Sapolsky, who is professor of biology and neurology at Stanford University. He is the author of several works of nonfiction, including A Primate's Memoir, The Trouble with Testosterone, and Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And he is the recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. And he'll be in conversation with Professor Joshua Green, who is professor of psychology here at Harvard and is a member of the Center for Brain Science. He's an experimental psychologist, neuroscientist, and philosopher. He studies moral judgment and decision-making. His current social scientific research examines strategies for improved social decision-making. That's just one among many things that he studies, but relevant here. And he's the author of Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. And tonight they'll be discussing Professor Sapolsky's book, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. And I'll let Professor Sapolsky tell you about the book and a bit about what's in it. But I just want to say The Guardian describes it as laying out the reasons why our everyday actions are predetermined and why we shouldn't despair about it. Um, and and then Psychology Today says that it's witty and engaging, and it's a goldmine of fascinating information on many, many interesting topics. So we're very, very excited. I do want to say, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A at any time, and then at the end, we'll be asking those Q&As. And then in just a moment, I'll drop a link into the chat that has it connects to the book where you can buy the book. So whether or not this has all been predetermined, we're very grateful to be here and hear this talk and conversation. And with that, let me pass it off to you, Professor Sapolsky.
Okay. Well, delighted to be here, wherever here is in the ozone. Thank you for having me on. And Josh, thank you for agreeing to do this. Listeners who may not be familiar with Josh, he is one of the gems of Harvard. And if you see him in the square, go take him to Felipe's and buy some burrito for him there because he's wonderful. Okay, starting off. As described, I have the stance that there is no free will, not whatsoever. Not that there is less than people generally think or whatever, but that there is none at all. And in that regard, it puts me out in the lunatic fringe of people thinking about the subject. And I think I'm even more in the lunatic fringe in that what it leads me to is concluding that it would actually be a fabulous thing if people stop believing in free will. It would make the world far more humane, a much better place. Okay, so what is my argument about? Let me start off with just 2 slides. Okay, I spotted this one online somewhere or other, and you see the scenario here, and our kid's saying, okay, where was I parachuted into? What is my life going to be like? And who are my parents? Where Mississippi, your parents are middle school TikTokers. And what's worth doing is exploring exactly the consequences for this kid by the fact that they exercised their free will and chose to be born in Mississippi rather than Norway. Life expectancy is 11 years shorter, 5 times the infant mortality rate, almost 40 times more likely to be murdered, all that sort of. Oh my God, the randomness of luck. Or, as one person who commented about this one online, they said, my God, this kid is screwed. And that's basically my starting point for all of this, which is when you, oh, did I just stop screen share? Am I still here? Um,
What's going on?
Should I start singing or something like that? Hello, everybody.
So maybe in the meantime, what I can do is I will drop the link to the book here in the chat for everyone to see, um, which is I can attest the book is wonderful, and I hope everyone checks it out from Harvard Bookstore.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll have Robert back in just a moment.
You know what I could do while we're waiting is lay out some terminology that's likely to come up, and that way we get that out of the way. Oh, never mind. Looks like Robert's back.
Okay.
We got one of those green screens. I see.
um, well, let's see. I
Is
can
it showing
hear
now?
you guys. I can't see anyone.
Can they see it?
Can you see
Hmm.
me?
Your screen is green. Unfortunately, we can't see your video at the moment.
Um,
Do you
huh.
want to turn on more?
Well, this is problematic. Let me try switching computers.
using my computer.
Apologies. I don't know what has just happened here. Um,
Let's just try to turn it
okay,
on
we're
from
switching
there.
computers over and out. Hopefully, see you momentarily.
Oh God,
Well, thank you all for bearing with us. I don't think I think that's a great idea. I mean,
Okay.
fit in as many terms as we can
Sure.
before.
Well,
Yeah.
so the question about free will and determinism sort of arises out of an understanding of the universe as mechanistic, right? That the universe is governed by physical law, and that things that happen because something happened before and something happened before that, right? And when people first realize that what if it's all what today we would call clockwork, right? Then how can it be that anyone really makes free choices, right? And the basic responses to the problem of free will, sort of there are three main camps, right? So you have the hard determinists on one side who look at the clockwork universe, universe governed by physical law, and say, okay, well, there is no free will. And even if there's some randomness due to quantum mechanics, that's not enough to give people free will. That would just make people's behavior random, right? So one response is to say science essentially has taught us, after some speculation from philosophers, that the universe is this deterministic, mechanistic clockwork world, and there's no free will. At the other end, you have what's called libertarian free will, which is not really related to the political philosophy, or it's related maybe a little bit to the political philosophy, but it's a term of art. And libertarian free will is the idea that there is something metaphysically special about humans and maybe some other animals, because we have the power to determine which of possible futures will take place based on our choices, holding the past constant, right? So if the universe is exactly the same way up until the moment that you're choosing between chocolate cake and a piece of fruit, right? Both of those futures are open, one where you eat cake and one where you eat a piece of fruit, with the universe being exactly the same. And what makes it go one way or another is not just some little random quantum mechanical blip, but your will, right? And one way to put this is that something like a tiny miracle happens in your head every time you make a real decision, right? And then the middle view, I was just running through some terminology that might be helpful, so I'll just finish the thought. The middle view, which I think is the major target in Robert's book, is what's called compatibilism, that accepts the idea that we live in a clockwork universe, does not think that there's a tiny miracle happening in people's heads, but nevertheless says that we have free will, and the kind of free will that can justify our interpersonal and institutional practices of reward and punishment. So got a little terminology out of the way so you don't have to bother, Robert. How does that sound?
Thank you. Can you just do the rest of this while I try to figure out which button I hit by accident? Well, I don't know what you just said, but I'm sure this was a great introduction to all of this. So as you heard, perhaps I'm an incompatibilist. Yeah, if you believe in atoms, if you believe in cells, if you believe in stuff like that, it is not compatible with the notion of there being free will. And I think where people run into trouble with that is a realm in which we make decisions that just intuitively feel so much like free will that we fall for it. Which is to say, you're in some circumstance, you got to make a choice. You got to choose what flavor ice cream. You got to choose whether to pull a trigger and kill someone, one of those choice moments. And you form an intent as to what you're going to do, and you act on it. And critically, you were consciously aware of having that intent. You had a pretty good guess what the consequence would be. And most importantly, you knew you didn't have to. You knew there were alternatives. And for most people, including the criminal justice system's people, that is necessary and sufficient to decide that free will has been shown, responsibility, culpability, all of that. And people have spent decades having all sorts of minutia-filled fights over, at the moment you become aware of an intent, what part of your brain has already signed up for that intent, versus is there a difference between an intent and realizing you have an intent? And people, and for my money, that is totally irrelevant to the free will question. Because in the face of somebody forming that intent and knowing that there are alternatives and acting on it, all of that, blah, blah, you are not asking the only question you can ask, which is, so how did you turn out to be the sort of person who would form that intent at that moment? How did that happen? How did that happen that you were there and this is the intent you formed? And that is where everything about there being free will falls apart. Because you have to ask, well, Where did that intent come from? It came from stuff that happened in your brain, 3 milliseconds ago. It happened as a result of environmental stimuli in the prior minutes before your brain did that. It was influenced, it was shaped by your hormone levels this morning, whether you went through some sort of trauma in recent months or years. Did you find love? Did you find God? Did you what? Because all of those will have changed your brain. What was your adolescence like? What was your neighborhood? What was your upbringing? What culture did your parents raise you with? And unlike the scenario we just saw of that kid's bad luck starting the moment they were born and found out they were in Mississippi, your fetal life was essential also, and a whole world of whether your luck there was good or bad. And then back to your genes and back to the evolution of those genes and back to ecology that shaped what kind of culture your ancestors came up with, because that was shaping how your mother mothered you within minutes of birth. And the whole point of this is not to say, oh, there's all these different factors out there. There's genes and there's hormones and there's culture and all of that. When you look closely enough, they all turn into one thing. They all turn into a seamless arc of influences. For example, if you're talking about genes and behavior, by definition, you're talking about millions of years of the evolution of those genes. And by definition, you're also talking about your 9 months of fetal life when those genes were being epigenetically programmed to do this or that. And you're also talking about the proteins you made after breakfast this morning in your brain under the direction of those genes. And when you look at how all of these different disciplinary approaches merge into one, when you look at that, what you see is there's not a damn crack anywhere in that edifice in which you could shoehorn in a notion of free will. So what do I mean by free will in this case? I mean, show me a neuron or a brain or a person, whatever level you want to get to, show me a behavior that has just happened and show me that that occurred completely independent of that brain's history, that brain's childhood, its genes, that person's place and society. Show me all of that. Show me how, given what we know about everything from the evolution of your genes to what experience did to them and what you made in your brain 3 minutes ago, show me a mechanism by which your neurons could have just done something completely independent of your history. And nobody can do that. And there's a long sort of tradition now of saying to people who don't believe in free will, ooh, prove there is no free will, prove there's no Easter bunny, prove that, absence of proof of absence. All by now, we know enough about the workings of our brain and human behavior and where that stuff comes from, that it is time to shift the onus onto people who claim there's still free will. Show me how it works. Show me how those neurons would have produced that behavior, regardless of what occurred from everywhere from 3 milliseconds ago to a million years before. Okay, so that's sort of the biological angle I'm coming at it, where one can conclude we are nothing other than the sum of our biological luck, over which we had no control, and its interactions with our environmental luck, over which we had no control. And that has gone into making you who you are and why you are the person who formed that intent that you did. For a very simple reason, you could not have successfully intended to intend otherwise. You could not have successfully wished to wish for something different than what you wish for. You could not will yourself to have more willpower. You are who you are as a result of everything over which you had no control, which brought you to that moment. Okay, so where do people get frenzied at this point? First one they say is, what about the amazing exceptions, the inspirational ones, the ones who overcome and pull themselves up by bootstraps and all that sort of thing? Where did the rare exceptions come from? And what we get into there is this very dangerous false dichotomy. There's stuff we're handed in life, stuff we had no control over. how intelligent you are, if you're tall enough to play in the NBA, whether your parents were wealthy or homeless. There's stuff you're handed that you had no control over. And then where this false dichotomy comes in, there's the what you do with it. What you do, do you show gumption? Do you show backbone? Do you squander your gifts? All of that. And this dichotomy that this stuff here you had no control over is made of like biology yuck in your brain. And this is the measure of you as a person. And where that one comes apart is when you understand sort of the biology of why some of us never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, why some of us are more self-disciplined, why some of us do long-term planning or impulsive or what, and make the right choices or make the wrong ones. And it's made of the exact same biology as is any other attribute that we can recognize we had no control over. So that's one thing to be taken on. Next thing is people freak out and say, oh my God, even if there is no free will, you can't tell people that because they'll run amok, because you can't be held responsible for anything. And there's a very, very convincing science by now showing that people, after their first few moments or days or years of dealing with this, are not going to run amok. Something else that's not going to happen is you're not going to say, oh, well, let's just have the streets filled with murderers. You can build a world in which you can protect people from dangerous things and dangerous people without invoking intent or free will or souls or any such thing. And we do that all the time. And one of my points is we do that so easily, we don't even recognize the realms in which we have subtracted free will out of our thinking. And still we protect society. Next thing people freak out over, oh my God, are you saying everything is predetermined? Like 2 seconds after the Big Bang, it was already clear like what's going to happen next week. No, that's like Calvinist predeterminism. Because of chaos, chaotic nonlinearities and such, there are multiple possible futures. The future was not written back when. It is only when you act to enact one of those possible futures that you could then see where was the determinism that came in. And the most important punchline to come out of that is don't conclude, oh, there's no free will, nothing can change, don't bother trying. We change incredibly dramatically, individuals, societies, everything in between. And all one has to sort of come to terms with is we do not freely choose to change. We are changed by circumstance. And we are changed at those junctures in a way that is a function of who we turned out to be when we experienced that circumstance. And change is absolutely possible. And in some ways, sort of the most like useful thing that comes out of, oh my God, just turning us into biological machines, doing so teaches us where the buttons are and where the levers are. And that's how we go about changing other people's behavior. And if we have lucked out under this sort of person capable of self-reflection, that is how we can turn some of that stuff inward and bring about change within ourselves. So change can happen. Okay, but at the end of the day, where people most freak out and where I think I get the most pushback is saying, okay, maybe that's true and we won't have murderers running around, but what a drag, what a depressing drag if we decide that there's no free will. Yeah, not just because of the murderers, but oh my God, I worked so hard to become the CEO of my company. Do you mean I earned nothing? I am entitled to nothing. I deserve nothing. Does it mean that praise and reward are utterly irrelevant? Yes, along with blame and punishment. Does it mean that any version of entitlement is unearned? All of that. And oh, this is terrible because I've had to work hard to study hard and resist temptations or to become a kind person or a generous one and all of that. And what does it mean if that's just the outcome of this mechanistic stuff under the surface there? And my final point there is, if you were bummed out by that, if you were bummed out by the notion that you did not earn your socioeconomic status, your corner office, or being loved and being capable of loving or any, if you're bummed out by that, by definition, you're one of the lucky humans because You are in the rare subset of humans who were treated way better than average for reasons you had nothing to do with. And when you look at the people who instead are treated worse than average for reasons they had nothing to do with, deciding there's no free will is utterly liberating. And when we look at the history of that, every time we've subtracted it out, it became a better world. At some point 400 years ago, we figured out that there are not these things called witches who could control the weather, and thus you burn them at the stake. Oh, that's a better world when we figured out that humans didn't have the willpower to change and cause storms or whatever. So for centuries, we believed epileptic seizures were a sign of demonic possession, and treat the person accordingly. And then we figured out, nah, it's screwy potassium channels or something. We figured out in the last 50 years that Freudianly toxic mothers do not cause schizophrenia in their child because they secretly hate the child. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder with genetic components. We figured out that there's some kids who have trouble learning to read, not because they're lazy or unmotivated or can't focus or aren't smart, but because there's some microarchitectural screw up in one layer of one part of their cortex, so that closed looped letters, they flip them around and they have dyslexia. And that is one within my lifetime. And it is a far more humane world now than when I was a kid watching the kid in a class who wasn't learning how to read. And we all had attributions. And we have figured out, oh, they had nothing to do. And we're more and more fronts with this. No, you don't have a off-putting personality that makes you deserve to be alone all your life. You got autism spectrum disorder and you have trouble. No, you are not morbidly obese because you lack willpower and you secretly hate yourself. You got a screwed up version of like the leptin receptor gene in your hypothalamus, and you don't get a satiation signal like other people do. All that has happened over and over is every time we subtract out a notion of somebody could have done otherwise, the world becomes a more humane place for most people. And my final point is that if the downside of accepting that is the lucky folks like us who wind up saying, oh, maybe I didn't earn my position in society. Maybe I didn't earn my clean running water and electricity and freedom from rampaging warlords and all the other ways in which things turned out lucky for me. Okay, so deal with it. So that's kind of where I get to that there's no free will when you look at the biology interacting with environment, blah, blah, blah. There's some psychologically truly tempting times where we're just begging to see agency, where there actually isn't. The roof isn't going to cave in when people decide there isn't free will. And in fact, it's going to become a much better place for most people. So why don't I stop here? And Josh, if you could continue with your lecture while I was scrambling to restart my computer.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, first, I just want to say that it's just a great pleasure and a joy to be doing this with you, Robert. As you know, as I've told you, but the audience doesn't. You've really been an inspiration to me since I was in college, and I started reading your books, and I've read every single one since, and they've all been fantastic, including the most recent one. So thanks for this opportunity, and 1,000 Harvard Square burritos to you as well. So I guess I feel like an obligation where I have to kind of do my best to present the opposition to some extent. And I'm in the awkward position of being one of the few people who pretty much agrees with you about the whole big picture here. And, we're both outliers in that regard. But I want to try to, in my own words, make a little bit of the case for the compatibilist who we, in the end, both disagree with. And that way the audience can get more of a feel for the depth of your argument. So what a compatibilist says, and again, a compatibilist is someone who accepts determinism, right? So determined, cover of the book, great, that's fine. But I still believe that there's free will in a meaningful sense, in a morally relevant sense, perhaps in a legally relevant sense. And what a compatibilist would say is free will does not require having a tiny miracle in the head. That everything you've said about that beautiful seamless mechanistic arc from genes to molecules to cells to circuits to whole brains to societies and cultures can accept all of that. What a compatibilist wants to say is free will of the kind that's worth believing in is about a certain kind of psychology, that it is about having a beefed up, more forward-looking kind of brain that can think in terms of consequences, especially long-term consequences, that can be more integrated in terms of its values. So it's not like when you're opposed to racism, this is channeling Harry Frankfurt, it's not just that you dislike racism in the way that you dislike tuna fish sandwiches. If you stopped liking tuna fish, that would be fine. But if you didn't stop liking or stop disliking racism, that wouldn't be fine. That there's a kind of integration, there's a capacity for reflection, that there's a kind of maturity that is the basis for real free will. And that's real, and that it matters even if it doesn't give us everything that we might want from it, right? So to make this a little bit more concrete, right? So I know you have a daughter who graduated from Harvard recently, and again, congratulations on that. At one point your daughter was 2, 3, 4, 5, and her mind was not as mature and developed as it is now. And when she was 4 or 5, maybe she lied to you about something, and she knew she was lying. You could tell by the look on her face, right? And you reacted to that however you reacted to it, very humanely, I have absolutely no doubt. Now your daughter is, I'm presuming, in her early 20s, and if she lied to you now, and not just because it was a surprise party, but something more serious than that, you would respond very differently. And the question then is that just a mistake that you would respond differently? Or is there at least a half-truth to the idea that your daughter is more free and more responsible now, and her telling a lie about a serious thing now means something morally that it didn't mean, that it couldn't have meant when she was a young child? And in practical terms, someone who's matured is someone who has a psychology that is deterrable, right? Or motivatable, right? That the long-term prospects of prison on the one hand, or doing something wonderful for society on the other hand, is capable of organizing behavior over a long period of time. And those psychological features certainly are important functionally, behaviorally, but you might think that they also matter morally and in terms of one's responsibility. So what do you say to the compatibilist who accepts your entire scientific story, but wants to say there's something important about that kind of psychological growth, not just functionally, but morally and in terms of one's responsibility?
Good. Well, I think that was a great summary of sort of Daniel Dennett's view, the late Daniel Dennett, who of compatibilists, probably the person I most vociferously disagree with. And it's a loss. He died a few weeks ago. He was a fun person to debate, which I did a few months ago. But his stance was one, yeah, obviously you don't ask 5-year-olds, but one matures into having free will. Or in his case, in addition to free will worth wanting, free will worth being held responsible for in a culpability sense. And where he would weasel out of it is with fairly useless words by saying, at that point, any reasonable adult should have matured into, any sensible person, okay, those are very heavily laden words, which is another way of saying the people where that didn't work out that way. They did not mature into having good impulse control or self-discipline or whatever. And thus you look at like what that maturation is about. Once again, it's luck. What sort of neighborhood you were in? Was it teaching you to be trusting or not? Was it teaching you what sort of frontal cortical gene expression did you have? What sort of dopamine D4 receptors did you have variants, and thus how much impulse issues did you have? All of that. How did you get to that point? And the point is, some of us got there more easily than others, simply again because of luck. I mean, so there's a circumstance where, like, you get two people and they're about to rob a liquor store together, and one of them says, you know what, this is not a good idea, and the other one goes ahead and does it. Whoa, how'd they turn out to have such different capacities to do the right thing? Are they morally different? No. One of them had a frontal cortex that developed for 11 different genes, culture, environment, reasons, so that they're better able to do long-term planning. Or they're capable of introspection and saying, oh, well, let's do a thought experiment. How would I like it if I wound up in jail for 3 years? Nah, that's not. They introspect. They have respect for the process. They're capable of doing that. Their horizon of time discounting is longer than and all of this is nuts and bolts stuff. And when you look at wow, they had the opportunity, they didn't have to do that. By that point, they had become the sort of person where that was all they could do. So the maturational argument on Dennett's part is basically one saying, well, anytime it works out okay, we could say we mature into adult control and free will and responsibility. And when it doesn't, they're not reasonable people, so let's not pay attention to them. We don't grow into whatever we become independent of the growing capacities we grew into previously.
Well, I think what you said makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like you'd agree with this, that you're not denying that there is practical value in having systems that reward good behavior and in a no more harshly than necessary strategic way punish bad behavior. But I think, and this is where I think we both centrally agree, the big mistake of humanity in this domain is retribution. That is punishment as an end in itself, not because of over and above whatever practical benefits may come from it in terms of deterrence or in terms of incapacitation. And you know, if the audience wants a fight over that, I give, because I think that's sort of central to the shared outlook we have. With that in mind, I want to sort of ask you a practical question that asks you to go beyond the book, and this is, how do you move this forward socially? So, you know, we've both been in the business, you much longer and more adeptly than I have, at trying to put forth philosophical, scientifically informed philosophical arguments to change the way people think for the better. And I know personally, I've been pleased when I see some little glimmers that it's doing some good somewhere, but also a feeling of there's got to be a better way to change the world. And I've gotten, as we discussed when I talked to you last time, more interested in trying to build things out in the world that might change people's behavior without trying to change their philosophies, but by providing environments that give people the kinds of decisions or experiences that lead to better decisions. And you tell this great part in the book where you talk about the student at your office hours who is, you know, a little sick of hearing you, you know, say that there's no free will, and they pick up the pen from the desk and say, look, I just picked this up. Are you telling me that I have no free will? And at that moment in the book, instead of you saying, you know, going off on a philosophical argument, you start to describe the statistical correlates of making that kind of argument, that person is, this is, you know, and you acknowledge that this was not based on hard data, but your sense that person is more likely to be male, more likely to not be an immigrant, or to not be an immigrant who was a refugee fleeing a war-torn country, that this person was more likely to be someone who was maybe a little irritated with you, maybe you, the way you put it, you know, that guy's a blowhard like my dad, or something like that. And behind that kind of somewhat serious and somewhat tongue-in-cheek description of the person who digs their heels in on that argument is the thought that people's life experiences shape their views about these things and make them either more open or more closed to the idea that luck plays a huge role in who wins and who loses and who gets what. Now, you were sort of pointing to the accidents of history throughout your book and in that wonderful anecdote. Uh, can those experiences be produced deliberately? Can they be, to take a sort of word that's gone out of favor, engineered? That if if you had couple of $1 billion, and you wanted to build something that would open people up to this liberating truth, what would you do?
That's a wonderful question, which the two of us have talked about, because we both have that same itch of let's do something other than like make our CV weigh a couple of more ounces than it does now, and have something useful come out of this. I made an attempt, of course, being at Stanford and in the shadow of Silicon Valley, hooking up with some techie people down there with an idea that I had for how to online get away with lessening people's implicit biases about certain things. And it was Machiavellian. It was going to transform the world. And it turned out the company went out of business during COVID. And so it didn't happen. But some of the things that I think come out of this is one, something that is a soundbite for me around the clock. And I know you taught us this to a large extent. You can't reason somebody out of a stance they weren't reasoned into in the first place. You got to get stuff on the emotional level and fear and anxiety and why the world's a scary place to them and why the past irrationally seems like a nicer, more empowered, privileged one, and going through all of that. You got to get people operating on the implicit level, but more and more what I'm realizing is you got to get kids, you got to educate kids differently. And, we wanted to raise our kids so if they did something wrong, they would take responsibility, they would have a sense of ownership when something went, oh, and that's totally wonderful. And I think the goal instead is to get kids to develop a mindset where anytime they see anyone do something that is remotely off-putting to them, that their first thought is, how did they become that sort of person? What is it they experienced that I never did? Where did I look out where they didn't? And, this is part of a nice liberal agenda, but to really, really hammer that one in there because like I, as an adult, half a century later, whatever, somebody cuts me off in traffic and I'm pissed off at them and think they have a rotten soul until I can kind of get a hold of myself and say, well, what are their circumstances? What I think is the much harder one is getting at the realm. Yeah. We can figure out how to like quarantine violent people and protect folks from that and not invoke, Beelzebub in the process of saying what's wrong with them. In the realm of getting rid of praise and reward as virtues in and of themselves, and meritocracy as having a moral worth that is incredibly destructive at this point. Yay, let's get rid of that. But how are you going to motivate people to do the hard work? So just as you don't want to go out on the street and there's a random murderer who's been let loose there because people don't believe in free will, you don't want to come down with a brain tumor and they pick a random person from off the street to do the surgery on you because elitism does bad things. This is how do you take the toxicity out of it? And I've been struggling a lot with this. Dacher Keltner at Berkeley, we've been talking quite a bit about this wonderful psychologist of how to get the world to the point where instead of something that we view as a high watermark, a gold standard at this point, you do something and the other person says, I am so grateful that you helped me just now. I'm so grateful that you were kind in that way. To reflexively to really think and be able to say, I am so grateful that it happened to turn out that you're this sort of person who could have helped me. And if you hear that enough times when someone is not thanking you, but thanking your circumstances, maybe after a while you begin to think instead of, whoa, that's so great, I turned out that I'm grateful that like this happened. How did it turn out that my fingers can do this? And when I do this in a concert hall, I move people to tears. Whoa, where'd this come from? Yeah, it's a long stretch, but at the end of like, what do you do with our toxic meritocracy, a world in which I'm so grateful that you happen to turn out this way. And we do that one all the time in a tongue-in-cheek way when we say to somebody, tell your mother she did a good job. That's saying, um, it's great that that happened to turn you into this sort. If that's what we do in all those cases, and we start that off with kids, and I'm so grateful you turned out, and here's why that kid didn't, and here's, as usual, get them in the cradles, because by the time we have them in our classrooms, let alone by the time we're getting people to hopefully read our books, the most formative ways of thinking all we are is the sum of our luck, that came years before. So I am being forced to actually think about like child education, about which I know absolutely zero, despite being a parent.
Great. Well, that sounds like the place to start. So I could keep going with questions. I actually forget where we're supposed to end or what our updated timeline is. But Greg, if you want to give me some guidance here on whether you want to me to keep going or open things up at this point, up to you, of course.
Yeah, so we I think we can go just slightly over 7 since we started a bit late. We want to make sure that we give the people what they ask for. So we have around 10 more minutes. So I think it would be great to get in questions from the audience. We have a lot of really interesting ones.
Okay, great. Let's see. Um, I'm gonna some of these are paragraph long, so I'm going to let's see. So okay, I'm gonna go with this one from Alice Flaherty. So I love your books. You started the talk today by saying it would be a great thing if we could all stop believing in free will. Do you have any tips to help us deal with our semi-hardwired perceptions of agency? I'm a neurologist who treats disorders of motor control like dyskinesias, Tourette's, and functional movement disorders, nay, conversion disorder. These make people look and even feel as if they are intentionally performing their symptoms. I've spent my career trying to convince families and sometimes myself to not blame patients for their behavioral symptoms, but our brains perceive and explain animate actions using different pathways than they perceive and explain inanimate events. When we try to see humans as both mechanisms and motivated actors, we get that creepy, uncanny valley feeling. What to do? Alice Flaherty.
Well, I think you've got relatively easy version of this, because why did this person just make barking sounds in the middle of the concert? Are they malicious? They got Tourette's, and we're slowly crawling our way towards understanding a little bit mechanistically about what's going on there. Why did this other person kill 9 people remorselessly? Oh, turns out they had a massive, brain injury when they were 3 from a car accident that took out their frontal cortex. And in cases like that, we're even making some progress at getting people to have thoughts about things like involitional impairments and things of that sort. And some juries even agree with that, because those are easy. You get someone who's just killed 9 people and their frontal cortex got taken out in a car accident. You sitting there trying to understand this, there is one hell of a huge steel cable going from that car accident to why they did what they just did. And in a circumstance like that, you can kind of get some sense about that. And the challenge, unlike you as a behavioral neurologist, we're seeing people who are certifiably neurologically impaired in some way or other, is when we look at everyone else, there is no single huge massive cable. Instead, there is a gazillion microscopic little spider webs of causality back to evolution in your fetal life and upbringing and all of that sort of thing. And for one thing, we don't know what most of those look like yet, and we're just learning. But much more importantly, it seems inconceivable that you put all those little spider webs together, and that's going to form something as deterministic as that steel bridge of causality from that guy's car accident. That one's easy. It's easy to see that one. It's easy to see Tourette's, whatever that is neurobiologically. But everyone else, whoa, it's just all these invisible threads that made us who we are. And it's hard to imagine they're all there, and that collectively that is why you became you.
All right, great. So we have a question. This is from Ryan DeVos, who asks, what is your stance on the meta-ethical question of morality? Would you say you're an anti-realist or realist?
Oh, damn, dirty words like that. Oh, I panic at this point. You know, I'm a neurobiologist. I don't know about your stuff always intimidates me, Josh, because you use words from philosophy. So I don't know what category I fall into. But if you take what I'm saying to its truly logical extreme, not only is blame and punishment makes no sense other than an instrumental form. Not only does praise and reward, not virtues in and of itself, all of that, but the very notion of morality makes no sense. The very notion of being able to forgive someone, which is an incredible high achievement that we all, that is truth and reconciliation commissions. Forgiveness makes no sense. That's like forgiving a virus for having a coat protein that's good at getting into your lungs. It's just so at the end of the day, none of that stuff makes any sense. And none of us have earned any more consideration of our needs than anyone else. None of us deserve anything. Hating someone makes as little sense as hating a viral coat protein. And if you really follow that through, and that being said, I've essentially thought this way since I was about 14. And once every 3 months, I am able to actually function that way for about 2.5 minutes. It's incredibly difficult. And all we can do is try, because each time we do, things get better in my view.
Well, so that's interesting the way you just ended that with the word better, which suggests that you believe in some kind of value, right? And when you say better, I'm guessing you didn't think it was just a matter of taste. Like you like vanilla, I like chocolate, you like suffering, I like happiness. Um, so when you kind of answered the morality question by sort of reducing all of morality to blame and praise, but you might think that there's more to that. And in fact, you wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be writing these books and you wouldn't, be trying to make the world better if you didn't think it was in some sense good. So, you seem to me like a member of the consequentialist club, or the utilitarian, or as I prefer to call it, depragmatist club, where you believe that suffering is bad. Well, all right. I'm telling you what you're going to say. I'm not going to. You tell me you can
Keep
finish
going.
that sentence
Keep
or
going.
or redirect it. But if we granted that you're not into to heavy metaphysical blame and praise, but what about goodness and badness?
In the last chapter of the book, I have one sentence that I probably spent more time on what I was trying to say and how to say it and all of that. And it is the most intellectually dishonest sentence in the entire book, where I say, okay, so good, bad, what does anything mean? Why bother? We're just machines. What to do with any of this? Are there any absolutes? Why do we bother? All of that. And sort of stumbling to this sentence where I say something like, to my vast intellectual shame, but like great relief, I have to say that even though it is logically impossible for a good thing to ever happen to a machine, it's a good thing when we make for good things happening to the biological machines that we are. Yeah, that stands up to about 2.5 seconds worth of dissection compared to everything else I'm saying. That's what I've arrived at. That's as far as I can push it. Pain is painful, happiness is frabjous. And you want to dissect that's a subjective stance. That's the pathetic, like, backdoor exit strategy I gave myself by the end of the book. I know this doesn't make any sense and this can't really work this way, but it's a good thing if there's less pain and more happiness.
Well,
It's
I'm
me.
I'm not sure that that's such a bad place to end up, right? So, where there are a lot of things that we'd say they have a quality or certain qualities that are inherent to what they are, right? That we have machines that can process, light and detect objects, but for now, at least we think they don't see, right? And you don't really know what red is, a la Mary the Color Scientist, etc., unless you've had that experience. And even if you can't put it into words, you understand the redness of red and the feeling of hot and cold and any number of other more complicated things. And you might say, if you don't understand that there's something bad about pain, then you don't know what pain is, right? If there's an element of value inherent in the reality, then why can't that be the grounding for a kind of moral framework? Leading the witness here, but tell me if you want to disagree. I just want to save the end of your book.
That's great. That's you arguing a stance because you have, oh, that's our National Geographic clock with something barking in the background for the top of the hour. That's you providing sort of legitimacy and cover for what seems like an embarrassingly indefensible bit of squishiness on my part. Insofar as there is a biology to the aversiveness of pain, and to maintain a really narrow view, there's a biology to the benevolence of the cessation of pain without getting anywhere into what happiness is about. Maybe one could pull out an ought, a should be from that. I sure feel on shaky ground, and I'll cave in within a second of it. But if you can argue, as you just did, that there's in fact sort of fundamental validity to framing it that way, that's even better. Why people should be nice to each other. Good. It's not just like bailing out at the end and NPRing all the science, whatever.
I think it's in my dissertation I argued that against that view. And more recently I've come around to the idea that the ultimate metaphysics doesn't really matter. What matters is whether or not we can agree on some standard of value, whether there's a kind of common currency that makes sense to all of us, independent of whatever else we might disagree about. And that's where I think there can be some kind of traction. So this is a longer discussion for another time. I want to come to you with a related question. So I saw recently that you were on Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast, and I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet. But I've learned a lot from Sam recently about ideas that are sort of prominent in Buddhism, but not exclusively too. And I've been continually impressed with how compatible at least a certain kind of Buddhist outlook is with a sort of humane scientific worldview. And this is a question you can completely punt on if you want, but I'm curious to know if that's featured anywhere in your thought that like, oh, there might be a deep cultural tradition here that's kind of got things righter than a lot of other ones. Am I putting words in your mouth there, or is there something there?
Yes, but happily so, because like I am definitely behind that. Again, towards the end of the book, and that last chapter was a bear to try to make any sense of all of this, but somewhere in there talking about, if you follow through the logical implications of all of this, among other things, there is nothing special about you. You have earned nothing more than anyone. You are no more deserving. There's no one who is less deserving than you, et cetera, et cetera. And I say, I've been told that this bears some vague resemblance to this Buddhist concept of unselfing. And at that point, I feel obliged to have a footnote saying I have nothing useful to say about Buddhism beyond that, but nonetheless, I see there's you're a certain type of humanitarian and you're a certain type of theologically minded individual or philosophically, or you're a certain type of behavioral neuroscientist. And you could come to the same exact conclusions about what are some of the most unfortunate things about the human predicament and what are some of the things that are routes to making it better. And that's, totally great that you could lock a Buddhist and a neuroendocrinologist in an elevator, and afterward, when they go into a bar, they've just identified two very different pathways for getting to it's better when you do good things instead of bad things to machines, even if the vocabulary is totally different.
Well, I'm sorry to have to cut off the wonderful conversation here, but we're just a little past time. So I just want to say that everybody who ended up here is very lucky to have, and we're very grateful for both of you coming. So thank you once again. Please check out the book. The link is in the chat, and hope everybody has a wonderful night. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Thanks for having me on. Thanks again, Josh. A pleasure as always. Good. Thanks for listening or watching this or whatever you're doing. Take care.
Okay.